correct. And, I actually will admit, when I was
Mhm.
growing up, that's all I thought about our ancestors. The only thing I'd ever heard was that our ancestors were enslaved.
Mhm.
So it wasn't really, I don't know exactly when I began to realize that that wasn't true, but I was definitely older. I was definitely an adult when
Mhm.
I actually realized that not all of our ancestors had been enslaved. Um, but for educational purposes, the term free people of color in the United States, and of course, we're talking about during the antebellum years, basically means any person who had any amount of African ancestry who was not enslaved before 1865.
Mhm.
So it could have been someone with pure African ancestry.
Mhm.
It could have been someone mixed with European, mixed with Native American, mixed with any other ethnicity, Spanish, French.
Mhm.
But if you had black blood, as I'll call it, and
Mhm.
you were not enslaved in these United States during
Mhm.
those years, then you were
Right.
considered to be a free person of color.
Does that include Native American too? Is that
So
still free people of color?
So in most places, if it was pure Native American and maybe tribal
Mhm.
persons, they weren't always referred to that way. But I have run across some areas of the country where they did use that label for Native Americans, but it's
Right.
very rare. They would just call them Indians, basically.
Right.
But if you're Native American and black, if you had a mixture, then yes, you would be a free person, consider a free person of color.
And then we would probably be having a different discussion as
Hmm.
well. And I do want to comment before I ask you the next question. I grew up the opposite. I grew up that everybody was free. I
Oh,
didn't
wow.
know. Yes. And I'm raised in Michigan. So I'm
Hmm.
just saying the difference, all of this stuff that I've come to learn was after I left Michigan. That
Wow.
at the age of 26 and so forth. But it's just interesting the viewpoint, and everybody's got a different story. So
Yes.
for the next question, this is a biggie for me. And all of go ahead.
So I've already messed up because I forgot that this is where I wanted to ask Brian if he would show slide 2, because I want to
Oh,
kind of
okay.
give a wider picture
Sure.
about what was happening here. So there have been a lot of misconceptions, and there are still a lot of misconceptions about free people of color. A lot of people don't know that there were free people of color in the South. They think all free people of color were in the northern states
Mhm.
where slavery either never existed or was earlier abolished. So I'd love to share this chart every time I talk about this subject. It was done by Aaron Bradford in 2008, and I've probably been using it since 2009. um, I don't think this is outdated information. But what you see here is you see numbers related to the collection or the enumeration of free people of color in every census between 1790 and 1860. Now, the pink represents the southern states, the states that were, considered the slave states, so to
Mhm.
speak, and the blue represents the northern states. And when you study this chart, you will notice that in every instance, there are more free people of color in the southern states than in the northern states. So that busts the first kind of misconception
Right.
that we have about free people of color. And then you can also notice the growth, as the Union or as the United States gained more states. You can see that the numbers are going up
Mhm.
each time. And as they go up in the north, they go up in the south. You see that. And by 1860, you have 250,000 uh, free people of color in the South and, 25,000 less in the North. And so I love this chart, and when you know, everybody will have the freedom to come back and revisit this
Right.
video and just study it a little harder. But I love how it shows us the differences between the North and the South and the growth over time of free people of color, which is going to be important as we get deeper into this conversation, because as this number of free people of color grew, so did the restrictions that were put upon
Mhm.
that demographic of people. And so now you can see why. You can see how much of the population this was encompassing. So thank you. Okay, we could take that slide down.
And
Thank
that's
you.
an excellent point right there, because as people do this research, we are going to run into what in the genealogy world we call the brick wall or the challenges,
Yes,
and I try to not use the word brick wall anymore because that tells me I'm not going any further than what I've got.
absolutely.
So I like calling it change, challenges that we have. So tell me some of the biggest or the largest challenges genealogists or family historians are going to face when they're researching free people of color, particularly during the 18th and 19th century.
Yes. So the one of the things that I realized over time is the importance of actually knowing the history of the period that you're researching. And I was never a history person before I got into genealogy. So for me, it's had to, involved a lot of going back and relearning things that I probably was taught in school but didn't
Mhm.
grab onto because it just wasn't my thing. So you must know the history and you must know the laws of the time and the place that you are researching. If you don't, one, you're not going to understand the context of a lot of what you will find in the records, but you also won't know which records to look for
Look
because you
for.
don't know what the laws were that created those records that we'll be talking about. So, in a nutshell, understand and notate the historical timeline to help frame your research on not just free people of color, but anyone that you are researching. And then the other challenge is finding the right records, knowing what they are, and then being able to find them, knowing where to find them. And even when you kind of have an idea of what you're looking for,
Mhm.
uh, you might not know every nook and cranny where they are. And I'm talking about pretty much in the beginning records that you would find for anyone because these are free people. So you're going to find land records, you're going to find court records, you'll find them in the newspapers, you'll find marriage records. And even if they were previously enslaved, you might find records related to their manumission from slavery. But where are those records? Well, we're going to
Right.
talk about that, and I'm going to show you some things a little bit later in the conversation. But when you're doing online searches, especially for these records, you have to know the keywords to use. So that can also be a challenge. Just for instance, what do we call them? You might use keywords, you might use abbreviations like
Mhm.
FPOC, Free People of Color, but you
Right.
might also type that out and put it in quotation marks. Um, free man of color, free woman of color, free person of color, free Negro, free black, Jean de Couleur Libre, if you're looking in
Yeah.
Louisiana,
Louise.
mulatto, griff. I mean, you have to know all these different terms because any one of them could be the one term that you didn't put into your search and it made you miss the record about your ancestor. So those are some of the challenges and some of the things you need to be aware of as you approach this type of research.
And I think this is an excellent point to say start making a list
Mhm.
of these identifiers of free people of color, so and so forth. Make a list because then
Absolutely.
you'll keep adding to that. And so
Mhm.
I think that's an excellent point, especially for folks that are trying to understand the difference. Either they were enslaved prior to, became free, or were they born free based on a
Yes.
law in whatever state that they're in.
And it could be something like this just came into my mind because I just thought about something I saw in a record a while back.
Mhm,
It could be something as I don't know if simple is the word, but as unique as uppity.
mhm.
That
Oh,
uppity
yes,
Negro. So
yes,
you will see that in a newspaper clipping,
yes.
maybe for a runaway apprentice, because
Mm,
just as you had runaway slave ads, you had runaway apprentice ads. And they might say, he's a rather uppity Negro.
uppity
So
Negro.
that's a key word also to use.
And then also in our African American culture, that is a common term that we use about the uppity Negro and so
Yeah.
forth.
Yes.
So, and coming online with that, and you made the point to say any of these identifiers of, say, free people of color, or just not necessarily free, but just people in color in general, those are identifiers that could lead to a record. So, could you give us one example where you got one of those identifiers that is of a free person of color that would lead you to such and such record? And I'm sitting here processing, trying to think of what I'm asking you, but
I
I
know.
think give us an example. So,
Well, so I'm actually going to be showing you some examples in a few
okay,
minutes, but I think
okay,
just those identifiers that I just mentioned,
name.
any one of them could lead you to records about
Mm-hmm.
free people of color, which is why you have to use them, all of them, in your searches. So let's say you go on and you do a search for free person of color and you put it
Mm-hmm.
in parentheses with the name Renata, whoever
Right.
you're looking for. And you might find two or three, get two or three results that actually do lead you to the right Renata.
Mhm,
Because if their
mhm.
name is Renata, it's probably going to be the only one. Uh,
Right.
but and so you think, oh, I'm finished. I found
Mm,
everything I could find. But
mhm.
if you go back and put free woman of color, you might get another one. If you go back and put free girl,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
black girl of color, you might find
Mhm,
another one. So
mhm.
like Shelley suggested, you do need to make a list, and I do that with my searches, especially now with the full text
Full
search.
text.
I can't keep up with what I've already done, so I do keep a list of
Mhm,
terms that I have already run through the full text search for each
mhm.
person, so that I know where I've been, and I don't keep doing the same thing over and over again, but also I don't omit a
Right.
possible search term that I could have had.
Now this is totally off to the right here.
Uh-oh.
Okay. No, no. Can the identifier lead you to a certain area? And what I'm thinking of is Griff. Isn't
Yes.
that a little known
Yes.
more in Louisiana
It
versus,
is
say,
very
Virginia? Okay,
yes.
so that was my point.
Mhm. It is very much a Louisiana term, and perhaps a little bit in Mississippi also,
Okay.
especially the areas that are closer to Louisiana. And last week we had Yael, who did just a fabulous, I mean, just an outstanding job of presenting what was almost completely a focus on Louisiana free
Yes.
people of color. Um, if you don't know this, Louisiana is its own thing when it comes
Its
to
own
free people
melting
of
pot.
color, and much of what was presented last week pertaining
Yeah.
to Louisiana, there are parts of it that also pertain to other areas of the South,
Mhm.
but then there are parts of it that really don't. And
Yeah.
so that is the importance of knowing your location,
Mhm.
knowing what was happening there, what was the population, what were the laws, what was acceptable, what was not acceptable,
Mhm.
because everything that was happening in Louisiana on a large scale was not happening on a large scale anywhere else. There may have been little pockets of it, but it definitely, that Spanish and French influence, the
Mhm.
fact that, just as she pointed out last week, that many of the free people of color, especially the ones who were enslavers, were related to and
Yeah.
descendants of the white or the French, Spanish, white, whatever
Mhm.
Creole enslavers that were there in Louisiana. And that's not always going to be the case in
Right.
other areas of the country. So yes, you must know your location and the terminology that goes with those locations. Very
All
good
right.
point.
Okay. So the next question, how does the scarcity and complexity of records impact free people of color research compared to researching formerly enslaved ancestors?
So that's a really great question. In both cases, whether you're researching free people or people you suspect to have been free, or the people that you know or suspect to have been enslaved, it's going to be challenging. So
Mhm.
they're both going to have you pulling your hair out. Um, but the important thing is making sure you know which way to go.
Mhm.
So I use a term, I call that the 1870 fork in the road. That is what I have substituted for the 1870 brick wall, because
Mhm.
like you, I don't subscribe anymore to the brick wall theory about 1870. If there's anyone who doesn't know why we're talking about
Right.
1870, it's because 1870 was the first federal census enumeration in which you're going to see people who had been formerly enslaved being named in the
Yeah.
census. So, if you don't mind me just taking a little minute with this, I want to make
No,
sure
go for
everyone,
it.
okay, I want to make sure everyone knows that all of our ancestors, black, white, green, and yellow, were enumerated in every census since 1790. It's just that if you weren't the head of a household between 1790 and 1840, you weren't named. So only the head of household would be named, and then everyone else in that household, whether they were free, enslaved, black, or white, they were represented by tick marks according to their age, their gender, and their status as to whether or not they were free or enslaved. Then in 1850 and 1860, every free person, free inhabitant, as they say, in the United States was supposed to have been enumerated by name on the census. And so this is where we begin to see not only the free black heads of households, but we
Mhm.
begin to see all of the family members of our free African American citizens. Well,
Mhm.
yeah, I guess they were sort of
Yeah, we're
citizens.
citizens.
And so, and then, but then in 1870, after emancipation, we now have all free inhabitants, which is the
Mhm.
same as 50 and 60,
Right.
free inhabitants, but everyone's free now. So this is where we first see their names. So there may have been one or two people listening who didn't know that. So I want to clarify that.
Yeah.
Um, so we go then backwards from 1870 and we have a split. We're either researching someone who was formerly enslaved or we're researching someone who was free before the end of the Civil War. Now, for the enslaved, you have to identify the enslaver
Right.
or enslavers in order to see most of the records that would be pertaining to that person before 1865. With the people who were free, you're going to be looking at records that I like what I already mentioned. You're just going to be searching for their name. They're going to have a first name and a surname prior
Mhm.
to 1865, and you'll be looking for them in those records that I mentioned, those land records, those marriages, and all of that. We'll take a look at in a few minutes. Um, but and there also were records that were created just about free people of color.
Mhm.
And so we will see some of those also, and you will be looking for those. Now, I do want to say, as an aside about the enslaved, the formerly enslaved, there are also records that happened that were created during the Civil War and just after the Civil War that can help you to identify them before the 1870 census. So those would be like records from the Freedmen's Bureau, records from the Freedmen's Bank, from the um, oh Lord, I just forgot the name, the
Southern Claims
Southern
Commission.
Claims Commission. That's exactly what I was trying to say. Some of those records, and then even later, if you find Civil War pension records, they can go back and give you information about those people prior to 1865. But to actually find them, what they were doing during that time, you've got to find the enslaver so that you can find their records. So back to the free people of color, I'd like to just share a few slides and take a few
Mhm.
minutes to show you some examples of the types of records that you might be looking for. Now, if I feel like we skipped something, Shelley, but I think, yeah, that's the part we slipped. So Brian can,
Well, that's
yeah,
the next question was about the laws. So if you want to build through that, that's fine.
okay, sure, yeah. So um, Shelley was going to ask me about the laws, about any specific
Yes.
laws that were put into place. Can you go
Yeah,
back to slide 3, or maybe oh, this is slide 3.
we
Okay.
got it.
What happened was during the colonial period, the earliest part of the colonial period, um, most of the laws that were in place until the very late 1600s, when they kind of started to focus on race, had more to do with your economic status than what the color of your skin was. But if you remember the chart that I showed you, and we can go back to that for a second, um, about we looked at how the numbers of free people of color were just building and building, and they're becoming more and more a percentage of the population. At the same time that was happening, there were uprisings that were taking place, and there were some notable uprisings. One from 1801 was a plan that got thwarted because someone snitched, and that was Gabriel's rebellion that was supposed to have taken place in Richmond, Virginia.
Right.
Well, after that plan was outed, and the powers that be saw what the potential of it had been, they got scared. And so they started to put new laws in place to kind of put their foot on the heads of free people of
Mhm.
color and take away some of these freedoms that they had already had. So this started happening just after 1801. And then there was another surge of laws that were put down after Nat Turner's rebellion, also in Virginia, that took place, that actually happened in 1831. And so
Mhm.
you begin to see these new laws starting in 1801, going forward through the 19th century up until really right before the Civil War, just increasingly restricting the freedoms of the so-called free people
You're
of
right.
color. One of the things that happened was if you're not aware, people, enslavers who wanted to manumit their slaves or set them free, in most states they had to pay a bond to be able to do so. And the bond amounts had been relatively low. But what you see happening during this period is an increase on the amounts required to be able to manumit your slaves. So just an example, and I'm not sure why the bottom of the slide is cut off. It is on my screen anyway. Um,
It's
but is it on yours?
yes,
I don't
but
know
that's
why.
okay. That's
Okay.
okay.
So in Louisiana, they instituted a $1,000 bond, and that's per enslaved person that you might want to set free. And the
Mhm.
emancipated person had to leave the state of Louisiana within 30 days. In North Carolina, there was a petition required. So you had to file a petition with the court. I want to set Renata free. Um, and you had to give 6 weeks advance public notice. And then any manumitted slave had to leave the state of North Carolina within 90 days, and they were never allowed to return. If they
Mm.
did try to return, they would be jailed, and they would potentially be enslaved.
Re-enslaved, possibly.
Enslaved or re-enslaved, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Brian. I don't know what's going on with that. Also in North Carolina, and I do have lots of North Carolina examples because, as most people know, that's where most of my research is.
Yeah.
Um, in North Carolina, free blacks had been allowed to own weapons, to own guns.
Really?
But over time, that privilege was taken away. And so you see the first example. This is actually an ancestor, a direct ancestor of mine, ordered that Simon Dunstan, a free man of color, be allowed to carry a gun for 1 year. This is in 1858. Also in 1858, same county ordered that Thomas Blacknell, a free man of color, be allowed to carry firearms for 1 year from this term of court. So all they had to do was get permission. That's all. But in 1861, just before the Civil War began, the North Carolina court system took those rights away. So free blacks were no longer allowed to own any firearms.
Which that's kind of dangerous too.
Right.
Thinking on the slave owning side or the white people's side per se, to allow a person free or, to have access to a weapon.
Yes.
After you talked about the rebellion and then Nat Turner and so forth. Wow.
Yes.
That's
But it
interesting.
just shows what the difference was
The
in
difference,
the
yeah.
community, in the thinking then. So since the slide is cut off, I hope I can remember everything that it said under it. But there was people are also often surprised to find out that blacks were able to vote. And so initially, anyone who was a landowner in colonial America had the right to vote. But then in 1787, states' rights were interjected. And so each state got to decide who had the right to vote. And so you begin to see the laws segregating voting rights at that time. Then in 1790, the Naturalized Citizens Act was enacted. And that is when really it was kind of, because of the language of this act, you had to be you could be an immigrant, but you had to be a naturalized citizen of the United States of America. And of course, our free people of color ancestors, they didn't originate from Europe, which is where the naturalized citizens had to originate from. And so they lost the right to vote in most cases, except, interestingly enough, in the state of North Carolina, which was the last of the so-called southern states that took away the right of enfranchisement from blacks, and they were able to vote until 1835, when the North Carolina Constitution was amended. And then you can see at the bottom the states, which are all in New England, in which black men, and I think everybody knows we're only talking about men here, no women of any race were voting. But Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts, they never lost the right to vote in those states.
That's fascinating.
Yes. So those are just some examples of the rights that we did have at one time that were taken away.
And the rights, and we're only talking, of course, of the free people of color.
Yes.
So next, can you share some strategies to overcome some of these challenges we're going to face, or gaps in the historical record when the traditional records are missing? And when I say traditional, I'm talking about maybe I can't find people in a census or a will or a deed. Those kind of things are missing. What are some strategies that you've used to overcome those gaps? And then we'll go to about online resources and things like that.
Okay. So, the thing about strategies, one is to do exactly what you're doing today, which is to educate yourself. Because the more of these classes, these webinars, attending institutes that you expose yourself to, the more approaches you will learn to implement for this research. Because what I can tell you is true is that nothing's always true. Something that may work for Shelley, where she's researching her particular free person of color
Mm-hmm.
ancestors might not work for me in Franklin County, North Carolina, or
Right.
Tyrrell County, North Carolina, where my free person of color ancestors were. And that is because there's no continuity of the records. Every location decided what they were going to do and how they were going to do it. And even if something was mandated by a particular state, the counties within that state didn't necessarily record things in the same way. Or they may not be, in one county, they may be located at the courthouse. In another county, they may be located at the register of deeds, like you just don't know. So you have to search everywhere for everything. What's that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All
I
at
know
Once?
what you're talking about. I
Something
can't
like
think of the full title,
that's
but
what doing African American research is like. Like you nothing is
yeah.
cut and dry. Like if there's a corner, you have to look in it. If there's
And
a
that's where there's no magic in
right,
genealogy,
yeah.
you
So
know,
I mean,
to come up with that.
that's
Yeah,
I know that doesn't sound like a strategy, but it
but it
really
is.
is a strategy. And then talking to other people or being
Mm-hmm.
in groups, even if they're
Mm-hmm.
Facebook groups or whatnot that are focused on researching free people of color, just you'll see an example of something that someone shares that they found, and you'll not have thought of that. And then you'll
Mm-hmm.
go and do your search with your parameters to see if that type of document exists for your
Mm-hmm.
location, or there was a word they used that you never thought of using. That
Right.
happens to me all that just happened to me this week. I can't remember exactly what it was, but something like that happened to me this week. Someone said one little thing and I was like, oh, I never thought of that, and I went
Yeah.
and searched it and found something. So
Mm-hmm.
just connecting with others, and leaning on each other and listening to one another so that you get
Mm-hmm.
new ideas. A very specific, I don't know, this is so much a strategy as a resource, that I would really encourage you to use is the family search full text
Okay.
search, which I think we've been preaching for everything now.
Yeah.
Um, if you're not familiar with it, it's family text full text search, and you
Mm-hmm.
find it under experiments when you go to family search. And these keywords that we've been talking about, you can plug them in.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you've been researching 30, 40, 50 years, all of us who have been researching that for
Mm-hmm.
decades, we are finding new records that
Yes.
we didn't know existed, about our ancestors. So I would definitely encourage everyone to use that. And then the last thing I would say as a strategy is that, we have so much available on the internet now. I cannot keep up with it. I've kind
Yes.
of decided I'm not even going to try to keep up with it because it stresses me out.
Yes.
Um, you need to, as a strategy, review and renew and redo your searches on a periodic schedule, whether
Yeah.
it's monthly or bi-weekly, whatever works for you. A search you did today is going to
Yeah.
bring you new results in 2 weeks, because
Yeah.
that's how fast things are being added to the internet. So just remember those 3 R's: review, renew, and redo your searches on a regular basis so that you can find new and different information about your ancestors.
And personally, don't take it that you missed it, because
Right.
it might not have been available.
Probably
So a
wasn't
lot of
there.
times we'll put that on ourselves. Oh, I can't believe I missed this. Well,
Right.
it might not have been up. And coming up to your point, family search and ancestry and them, if you're watching and paying attention, they're uploading 1 million records a week,
Mm,
a week. And
yeah.
that's two different databases, that we're recognizing right now. And of course, people that come into the Center for Family History, there's a kiosk and iPads that they can tap in to family search and things and get a little bit of assistance there, right on the spot. But I want to make another couple points that I'm seeing uh, almost a map that you're putting out here. Number one, know the community. Number two, know the law. And again, we're talking about free people of color, but this could also go to genealogy generally. And the
Yes.
other thing is looking at the local records. Yes, you get access to them online, which that'll be your next question and stuff, but about online resources and offline.
Thank
But
you.
the thing of it is, you're leading everybody for a path here. And I think this is an excellent point to say that. So I'm coming back to know the community, know the law that's happening during the time that you're researching. You're going to make that list of identifiers on the people you're researching just as a supporting aid. I also heard you talking about working with a group or working with somebody. Get a genealogy buddy, and stuff. And I have to believe for my years that makes the success because you're able to share and compare. And like you said, it could be one word. Oh, I didn't think about that. Let me
Mm-hmm.
try that. So thank you for that, because I'm appreciating that is going to the audience, that they can get that, get that type of roadmap, I'm going to call it. So on to the next question. And this is really about some best resources, online and offline. What can you share or talk about things about these resources for the audience to be able to think about or make note of?
So before I actually share the resources, I would
Okay.
love to just share some of the different types of records that we would be looking for when we go to these resources, if that's okay.
It
Because
is
I've
absolutely. This is me
okay.
and you. And we
So
talk at least once a week. So people are going to
yes.
have to get used to us just throwing stuff off at us.
Okay. So
Yeah.
Brian, if you could put me up at slide 10, please. No, I think that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
So, in a larger presentation that I do share some of the resources, the types of documents that you might want to look for when you are working to document the lives of free people of color. So, I'm going to show you a few. It won't be all of them. But one thing I want to make sure that the audience understands is I talked about how there are records that were specifically created for documenting the lives of free people of color. So, in addition to the regular stuff, the marriage records, the land records, and all that, we have these record sets available to us where we can find these ancestors. And again, you're not seeing the bottom of each slide, but I think there's enough here. There may be some little note on the bottom that we're missing, but we'll be okay. So, proof of free status. People of color were required in most of the, not even just the southern states, but also some of the northern states to register proof of their free status with the county government. You know what this was about? It was about keeping tabs on them, knowing who's in your county, who lives where, and how they got there and why they are there. So there are a lot of different ways this was done. There could be having to show a copy of your manumission papers and have them filed with the county. Some places did actual certificates of free status that people had to carry around with them or be able to show at any time. And then in just a few locations, and specifically, this is known to have been in Charleston, South Carolina, people had to wear these badges that you see, and they were referred to as freedom badges. So you see the front of one and the back of one, and they often had what the person's occupation was on them, and they wore them around their neck. So that's why you see the little hole at the top. Now, this is an example that I share that shows the free papers from Georgia for a man by the name of William Goings. And I can tell you what is missing is the citation at the
Right.
bottom of the screen that you're not seeing. But this William Going, and if you know the Goings, you know that's a big name in free people of color communities from several states, Virginia, North Carolina, and probably a couple of other states. But it tells you that he's a free man of color and he's coming in and applying to be registered in this location in Georgia. But look at the amazing information that it gives you. It tells you that he was born in Virginia and that he came to Georgia in 1787 at the age of 66 years. So that's going to allow you to do the math to get his
Yes.
birth year, to go realize when you need to look in Virginia records for him and when you need to start looking in Georgia records for him. Then it gives you the name of his wife, Sarah, and it gives you her age. And it tells you that she came a year later in 1788. And then it gives you the name of his daughter, Nancy Going, and she's 35 years old, and that by profession she is a weaver. And all of this is being recorded on the 18th of July of 1836. So again, you can do the math from 1836 to get his age, her name, her age, the daughter's age, and to know when and where you should research them. Court records I mentioned before. You will find free people of color all over the court records, not only for just regular things like land transactions and that kind of thing, but because of the laws that I mentioned to you that were put on them, they were often being accused of breaking those laws. And so this created court records. So here there's an example from Granville County, North Carolina, where someone is petitioning. Remember that they had to, I talked to you about them having to leave the state in some cases. So in this case, they're petitioning for Admiral Dunstan, a free man of color who lived in Mecklenburg County, Virginia, to be able to move into Granville County legally because he has married a woman from Granville County, and they want to be able to reside in that place. And then on the right, you have an example from Limestone County, Alabama. A free person of color, Francis Hamlin, purchased his daughter, Susan Locklear, from James Sims of Limestone County, and he's seeking to emancipate his daughter, who is married to Thomas Locklear, a free man of color. So there's a lot going on
Wow.
there, you know. Um, and it's a lot of important things going on there. And one thing I want to point out here is that this is an example of the type of black, free black ownership that you are more likely to see in states outside of Louisiana. Now, listen to me. I'm not telling you that there were not free blacks in other states who owned other blacks as property that weren't related to them. But what I am telling you is that in states outside of Louisiana, you're going to have a different balance. You're going to have way more blacks who own their family members so that they can get them out of real slavery. Um, than what you're seeing in Louisiana. And in Louisiana, you have more of what Yael was talking about last week, where you had free blacks who actually owned blacks for their labor and were not related to them. So this gives you a perfect example of that. This person has apparently gotten himself free, or maybe he was already free. His daughter is enslaved. We see who she's enslaved by, and he is trying to purchase her, but she's enslaved, but she's already married to a free man of color. So I bet you
That's a question I would have to come back and say, now wait a minute.
it did happen. It happened
Yeah,
a lot. It
right.
happened. It happened. I see it in my own family. I have a situation in my own family where there was an enslaved person married to one of my free people of color Dunstan
Mm-hmm.
relatives.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, so that's something a lot of people don't realize is that
Right.
that happened. It really did. And then there are newspaper accounts, and you can see at the bottom here, I think there's an animation that might not be working as I transferred
I
this
see it.
over. But these are just some different examples of where you will find free people of color in the newspapers and what the reasons. So the first example, somebody was breaking the black laws in 1839, and those are those laws that I told you had been put in place to restrict the lives of free people of color. Then you see them with doing estate and property transactions. So the following property belonging to the estate of Phyllis Wells, a free woman of color deceased, is being
Mhm.
sold, just like you would see for a white person. And then, breaking out of jail. So, here you've got escaped from the jail of Granville County in Oxford on the night of the 27th. Baldy
Mhm.
Kersey, a free Negro, very bright color and hair nearly straight, stout made and about 5 feet 8 inches high, about 45 years old. So, it goes on and on. And then there's Joel, who was enslaved. They're in the same newspaper article.
Right.
So you just never know. And at the bottom, you have some of those terms that was telling you you should search for when you're looking for people, in this case, in the newspapers. There are bastardy bonds. Now, bastardy bonds were for both black and whites who had
Right.
had a child out of wedlock, but you will find a higher percentage of blacks in these records, and they were free blacks who were in these records. The purpose of the bonds was to place responsibility of support for an illegitimate child upon the father should the mother be or become unable to provide proper support. Otherwise, the child would become a ward of the county poorhouse, which would be an expense to the county, which nobody wanted. And so they would institute these bonds. And I won't go through all of this, but I will just say that there was like in each state a different process for instituting these bastardy bonds and taking them into the court. The process that I have on the screen right now was from North Carolina. And then this shows you just an example from one situation where this man named Joseph Gibson was brought in to answer a bastardy bond. And you can
Mhm.
see here the steps. These are the records that were created just from this one bastardy bond. That's all going to give you information about that ancestor that you're researching. And then this is just showing you what a handwritten bastardy bond might look like, which is a terrible slide. Okay, so apprenticeships. This is
Yes.
another area that you are going to overwhelmingly find free people of color. Every state had its own laws in place for the binding out of apprentices. Again, I am sharing the North Carolina laws or
Mhm.
requirements. So first of all free base-born children, including children of color, so those are illegitimate children, had to be apprenticed. All minor children whose fathers had deserted their families and had been absent for up to 1 year or for 1 year, all orphans whose estates were so small that they could not cover the child's education and maintenance. And that is because in North Carolina, apprentices were required to be taught to read and write, regardless of color. It was exactly the opposite in Virginia. They were not
Correct.
supposed to be taught to read and write. And that term orphans that you see there, it means anyone who had lost their father.
Father.
So your mother could be alive and well, but you were
Yeah.
an orphan if you lost your father. Any child for whom application was made to the wardens of the poor, and all free Negroes and mulattoes where the parents of such children were not, in the court's opinion, gainfully employed. So all of these are requirements for having to create an apprenticeship. These bonds could be handwritten like you see on the left,
Mhm.
or they could be on pre-printed forms like you see on the right. And then again, here's an example, and these are from the North Carolina Gen Web for Tyrrell County. Someone has done a wonderful transcription on that site. The first arrow at the top is pointing to the apprenticeship of Charlton Hill, an orphan mulatto boy. This is in 1800. He was apprenticed by a man named Laban Heyman. And if you just look right up to the top, you also see his sister, Morning Hill, orphan mulatto girl, apprentice on the same date by the same person. That Charlton Hill is my third great grandfather, and he was 6 years old at the time. You can see down at the bottom other examples that I've underlined in red. You see an orphan boy of color aged 5 years, 10 months. That might be your ancestor that you might otherwise not have had a birth date for, and now you
Mm-hmm.
have it. You see orphan son of Elizabeth McCabe or Maccabee, some people say that name. There you go. You have a mother's name. You're going back another generation. And then where you see the second blue arrow, that is again my third great grandfather, Charlton Hill, 7 years later, being apprenticed to Moses Cater because his first apprentice master had died. Military records will also give you information about free people of color as well as people who had been formerly enslaved. You want to look for those compiled military service records, look for enlistment and full service records, pension applications, pension files, and anything related to U.S. colored troops during the Civil War. And please know that our ancestors of color have been involved in every military conflict in the United States since the Revolutionary War. Okay. So to answer the first question that you asked me that led
Yes,
up to this, okay.
that's
So
fine.
I feel like kind of that I didn't put a slide on here with things like family search and ancestry
Mm-hmm.
and those things because we should all know about those and they're easy to find. But I do want to point out that there are some state specific research resources. So you want to Google or whatever you use the name of your state and then free people of color or name of your state and free Negro records or something like that and put it in quotation marks. But the examples I have here, because every state was so different, as I've already mentioned. So in South Carolina, they had a tax called the Free Negro Capitation Tax. And anytime you see capitation, that's a head tax. It just means they're counting that particular part of the population. So the free Negroes in South Carolina had to pay this annual fee, and they had to do this in other places too. But if you go to look for these records, you're going to find names and you're going to find ages and you're going to find the years that they paid that tax. And that is unique to South Carolina with that wording, free Negro capitation tax. Also, I like to point out this wonderful website from Louisiana. It's the LSU Library's Free People of Color in Louisiana. And I bet Yael already talked about this more than likely. But if you have any no, Louisiana Free People of Color research, you're going to want to visit that site. And then, like I said, you have family search, you have ancestry, you have, you know, um, state archives, uh, state archives, and then university libraries. You want to go to all of these places and you just want to Google specifically. And then lastly on this, I would like to mention scholarly works because
Mm-hmm.
free people of color have been widely written about. And let me make this bigger. Okay. So you can just see some examples here. There are books, there are journal articles, there are dissertations. You want to use Percy and find out about any articles that have been written in different scholarly journals. And I have right here two that have been wonderful resources for me. So I should have mentioned like Charles Chestnut, Ira Berlin, going
Mm-hmm.
back in time to earlier writings about free people of color. More recently, because you all know my focus is North Carolina, I had already been giving talks about free people of color in North Carolina. And then
Mhm.
my friend Warren Miltier came out with his book,
Good book.
North Carolina's Free People of Color 715 to 1885. And then shortly after that, he came out with Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South, talking about beyond North Carolina. These are both resources that I highly recommend if you are researching people of color, free people of color.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, that was
Excellent.
kind of long.
No, excellent. Excellent. That is such a wealth of information. And so this is kind of somewhat not the last question, but I just have a couple more. Tell us about either a case study you worked on, something that you had great success with. So now we're giving hope to the audience that they will find with all of these resources. It never guarantees anything, but tell us, something that would be a success you would consider. And then I know Brian would like to ask the question after this. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take the word success out of it, and I'm
Okay.
going to say enlightenment,
Got it.
because I didn't know anything, as I've already mentioned. I didn't know about any of my family lines, but I particularly didn't know about these free people of color
Mhm.
lines. And I still have not, after about 31 years now of doing this research, I still haven't found, that big moment with my free people of color lines. I do
Mhm.
have it with some of my enslaved lines.
Right.
But there's one thing about my Dunstan and Bibby line, which is a combined line. I had an ancestor who was a fifth great granduncle. He was the brother of my fifth great grandmother, Frances Bibby, and his name was Solomon Bibby, and they're from Franklin County, Lewisburg, North Carolina. He was a Revolutionary War patriot,
Mhm.
as were several other of his Bibby relatives and several of my Dunstan ancestors. And Solomon Bibby lived from 1765 to 1845,
Mm.
and he had to fight to
Mm.
get his Revolutionary War promised pension and bounty land. Um, because he had to fight, there are a lot of records. And so, even though he's not my direct ancestor was his sister. I've learned so much about him. I've learned so much about their family through the pages and pages and pages of depositions, and because there
Mhm.
are court cases to get him, and it was such a small amount of money. I mean, I'm sure they spent more money trying to fight the case and argue the case than what the pension payment actually ended up being. But he did get it. He only
Mhm.
got it just a few years before he died. Um, but I learned so much. There's
Yes.
newspaper clippings also, as well as the court records on this. And the actual pension file itself. So
Mhm.
I would just say this is kind of a plug for when it's not your direct ancestor,
Mhm.
researching the records fully of the people around that ancestor, the fan club, the friends,
Right.
associates, neighbors, their family,
Yes.
um, can enlighten you to the situation of your family, even if it's not direct information about your great grandparent or your, direct ancestor. So that's one. And
Yes.
then I will just mention my Dunstan line again. Um, again, there's been no big like
Right.
ha 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 ha, but I have made connections because again, I
Mhm.
didn't know any of these people. I've made connections with Dunstan descendants, and the largest contingency of them I have learned left Franklin County and relocated to Philadelphia. And that is where they are. They know about Franklin County and they've come back and visited Franklin County. But I have connected with them, and it's something that's still ongoing. I had a hard time getting some of them to accept me, that I was part of their family, because they thought they knew their whole family. But we've done that now, and it's just been heartwarming to see that they are a very large and very close knit family. It's me. I'm the one that was missing out, you
Right,
know.
right.
So yeah, I don't have a big moment with my free people of color, but it just has been enlightening to me to learn more about my family.
And I think that's an excellent way of framing it, because everybody's going to measure success differently.
Hmm.
And so I'm going to throw it to Brian right now. You want to ask Renata a question or a follow up question?
I do. Hello, everyone. I actually have two, and I'm going to open it up to both of you because I like to hear both of your perspectives.
Guest first.
So, two families of mine, free people of color, they lived in what was then the westernmost periphery of Virginia, kind of almost on Shawnee territory. That's how far west they were. This is the colonial era. So, what are ways that we can research free people of color who they were marginalized people? A lot of them lived in marginalized land. And Renata, that's a cue for you for like the Great Dismal Swamp, just so you can kind of get that region in your head. How can we find information about them when they lived in places that didn't have courthouses, churches? They were literally in the territories as they were. Are any suggestions? No, I do. I have one. Um,
Good.
This ain't that. And I have one too, and it's probably the same suggestion.
uh, I'm thinking about my Bird and my Roberts family, and the Birds actually it was something called Bird's Gulch. And that was the only clue that I actually had, that a family called Bird who lived there. That when we see in the 1790, you see the free family of colors being enumerated for the first time, so I could kind of make that link. But apart from something like that, any suggestions about how you can actually find stuff on them?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. That's one of the challenges. But I would just say research everything you can about that area and see what you happen to stumble upon. And you mentioned Birch, Birds,
Bird.
Bird's
Bird.
Gulch, like in Lewisburg, where I own our family property, so I'm still there all the time. I was just riding around, kind of looking at things one day, and I ran into Bibby Lane, and I didn't know there was a Bibby Lane, and I found out that was where the Bibbies lived. So it could be, get on the map, the street map of your area, and see, if you find anything named for them. But talking to people and joining groups for that county or that location, so that you can put your surnames out there and see what comes up. And you mentioned churches. Make I know every church didn't leave records, but really check those church records, because you will find our antebellum free people of color as well as our enslaved in the records of the white churches. I'm talking about the white churches. Okay, look for them there. That's what comes to my mind, just off the bat.
And I'll follow up on that, because the big thing that she said was about talking to people. So one of the things that I do, and say I'm looking for the Sanders family. That's my family, and they're in such and such county, this, that, and other. Well, I'm not just going to look for Sanders, because as y'all know, research in African Americans, free or enslaved, names changes, there's spelling challenges, and so forth. So I look more at the whole community to find out who's in there, which also will lead me to church records and other records possibly. But if there's no courthouse or anything, this is almost door to door. You're
Yep.
going to have to talk to people door to door, There's nothing wrong with holding a little group get together, partner with the little church, or hold something at the local cemetery or whatever's there. You're going to have to do something a little bit different, but it's almost like Renata taught, that's, my family land. Well, you're going home. And so treat that you're at home and you're inviting people to come in and start talking. So that would be my suggestion, because it's a rural area. There's no courthouse. There's no tax office. There's only going to be a church or a school and a cemetery. And maybe if there's a chance, a library, but maybe not. There's areas that I've come across and none of those things are there. So you're going to have to go to that store or that gas station that might be there and start talking.
And again, the time period that I'm thinking of, mostly the kind of religion came from circuit preachers. Now, whether or not they kept records,
correct,
even
traveling
a diary,
ministers.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Those.
Oh, gee, have you?
Yes, in Virginia. But let me also just add, kind of like going door to door, go door to door in the records. So if there are family papers, manuscript collections, for anyone who lived in that community, go sit yourself at a table in the wherever they are, the archives, the university library, wherever they are, and go page by page. It's tedious, but that's what I was talking about, those nooks and those crannies and those corners that you can't miss, because there could be a mention in someone's family papers about your ancestors, and it might not be something good. It might not be something that you're going to be thrilled to find, but it could be there. And then I know you talked about the court not being there and things not being there. We had a speaker for Oggs Hampton Roads this morning who was sharing just some incredible court records for someone who was fighting to be free and not enslaved, because they felt that they were born to a free parent, whatever. And they lived in one place, but the court records were in another place. And so that's something to make sure you do a wide search and that you check anywhere that ancestor may have been, or maybe the next county over. Now, Brian, you said Western North Carolina, but you mentioned the Dismal Swamp, which is Eastern North Carolina.
No, I said
Western Virginia.
Oh, you said Western Virginia. Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to give you.
I'm thinking of Lee County, which is the last one going out.
But I wanted to give you just a really clear picture of the kind of place I was talking about.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, all right, gotcha.
My second question is, and we could have a whole podcast on this one subject, so don't go deep. Passing as white or assuming a white identity was not uncommon with free people of color because of the level of mixing that was going on. What is some clues that you can pick up from the records when you're researching your ancestors or family members to figure out which ones stopped being free people of color and assumed a white identity?
So I have a line that did that. That I have everything. Like, I'm everybody. And I share this in a couple of my other talks where I have the World War I draft registration for my great-grandfather's brother, William Green. He and some of his siblings moved to New York and were passing as white. And if you know about the World War I draft registrations, you know the corners were supposed to be cut off for people of color. His were not cut off. And on the form where it says race or color, it said white. And so I was able to verify the family lore that I had been given when I told you I was interviewing those ancestors in the 90s and those relatives in the 90s. And they are the ones who told me about William Green and about the other people from that line who had done this. And that record was kind of one of the first things that verified for me that yes, he was up there passing. And I do have a picture of him. He just looks white. And on the draft registration, it says that he has brown hair and gray eyes, which you would never see them say about a black person, because we all had black hair and black eyes, which I still have never seen anyone with black eyes.
I mean,
But so that's an example, into the 20th century of how I was able to kind of say, oh, yeah, he was passing as white. In the census, he was a different race every time.
yeah.
He was mulatto, he was Indian, he was white, he was never black, but he was all these other things every time. So yeah, just go deeply into the records. Make sure you read every hint in every part of the record might give you for those ancestors. And I was able to verify him in other ways because like his death certificate names his mother, which was my second great grandmother, and the informant was Ruby, which was his niece, who was also up there passing. She was part of the family lore also. So I knew I had the right William Green on all the records that I have for him.
And I'm just going to I'll respond to that. I just want to make one comment to add to what you're saying is use a timeline. And I'm saying to map out chronologically your ancestor, their whereabouts, and how they're identifying and so forth. And everything else that you said goes on top of that. But at least you're following it in order. And you made the statement of following the records earlier. So this is another case to be able to document that as well.
I also wanted to quickly build on one really important point that Renate made earlier in this conversation when she was speaking about Nat Turner
Yes.
in that time period. If your free people of color seem to disappear, see if it's around the time of a great racial or social period of upheaval. And I'm mentioning Nat Turner specifically because after that happened, and then the rights to protect oneself in parts of Virginia and North Carolina were diminished because people couldn't own guns, we start seeing large and extended groups of free people of color, usually related, heading out. Going into Ohio, Indiana, I think Illinois, and then you start seeing them going further north into Michigan. So if you have a free people of color family and it's been entrenched in a place for a couple of generations, and then all of a sudden it's just gone in like 1840, using Nat Turner as a reference, start researching where the big free people of color settlements outside of that state were located.
So excellent point. And I want to give Renate one chance to respond to one question, and then we can go to any Q&A that we might have. So Renate, what advice would you give family historians or genealogists, either beginners or somebody intermediate or advanced, that's just starting out on, say, researching free people of color? What would your advice be given to them? What would be the one thing you need to make sure they do? We've covered a lot, or you've covered a lot today, records, scenarios, and so forth. But what would be the one thing you would tell? And say if you're talking to me and saying, you need to know this one thing if you're going to start researching free people of color in your family.
I guess the what I would say is to frame the research by doing the step that I talked about in the beginning. Know the history of the place and the time. Know what the laws are. So set yourself up by doing a little bit of research first so that you know what to look for and why you're looking for it. And that's gonna start your timeline, because you want to put those important historical events and changes and laws into the timeline, so that you then, when you're learning about your ancestor and you're filling in the timeline, you can see why they left North Carolina and moved to wherever they moved to, because they had to get out, and stuff like that. And on that note, I did ask Brian if you wouldn't mind giving me 3 or 4 minutes. I realized that I was supposed to go on after I talked to you about the rights that the rights that free people of color did have before 1801 and the rebellions and whatever. I meant to just go on and show what happened when some of these were taken away. So it's like 4 really quick slides,
Sure.
Brian, if you could
You
go
got time. You
to
got time.
slide 6.
I'm also not seeing questions, but I'll let Brian tell us if then, but I'm scrolling through. So go ahead. And you
Okay, I'm
need
getting
slide
there.
4 after the bonds.
I'm going to it. Oh, he's doing it. I'm doing it
Uh-huh.
too. So we're both doing it at the same time. It's 6. 6. Okay.
Slide 6.
Yes. Okay. So I apologize, but so just take yourself back to where I was telling you they could own they could own guns, they could testify in court, and all the things that I told you they were able to do. And then here's what started to change after 1801, and then again after 1831. So just a few quick examples. In Alabama, after January 1st, 1833, it became unlawful for free persons of color to immigrate into and settle within the state of Alabama. Free Black persons who did move into the state were given 30 days to leave, or they would be dealt 39 lashes. These are free people. If they remained after that, they could be arrested and sold as slaves for 1 year. In Virginia, in 1858, free people of color could not buy wine or ardent spirits unless they had written permission from 3 or more justices that they were sober, orderly, and of good conduct. I think that is what is missing from there.
Right.
In Mississippi, free Blacks were not allowed to sell grocery items or liquor to the public. The laws also prohibited free persons of color from operating a house of entertainment or a printing establishment. You know why they didn't want them to have a printing establishment, because they're going to be getting word out to people. They did not want that. And in Texas, there's this timeline I have here, because Texas, when it became an independent state and an independent republic, they immediately created laws to expel the free people of color who were living there. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. You have to know if you research free people in Texas. But then in 1837, the ordinance was reversed. Now, by that time, some of the people had already left. But some had stayed and resisted. So they changed it in 1837 to say that people of color who were residing within the Republic of Texas at the time of independence, that was 1836, can now stay. But in February of 1840, a new act contradicted the 1837 reversal.
Wow.
So now it says free people of color have to leave by 1842, or they're going to be jailed or enslaved for life. Well, as a result of that, there are a bunch of petitions from free people of color requesting to be able to stay in the state. This is an example of something you're going to see in Texas that you might not see anywhere else during this period. Then this large group of people that are related to or referred to as the Ashworths, they filed 3 petitions, and they had the support of a wealthy, influential Ashworth slave owner. And so because of them, in November of 1840, so look, the act was in February of 1840. In November of 1840, the Ashworth Act was passed. It gave all free people of color who had come to Texas prior to independence in 1836 the absolute right to stay there. You need to know this if you are researching in Texas. And this last one, this is heartbreaking, but I have to include it because you have to know what we're dealing with. In Florida, a Negro, mulatto, or Indian could only give evidence in a trial where no whites were involved. These are free people. Where they could testify, any Negro who perjured himself was to have his ears nailed to post, and he would be forced to stand like that for 1 hour. Then after that, his back was to be bared and 39 lashes applied. This is for perjury in a court case. So this was my point in the larger presentation that though our ancestors may have been referred to as free, they weren't really free.
Right.
It wasn't, their freedom wasn't free. And these are just some of, and you can take that down, Brian, because I don't want to look at it anymore. But these were just some of the situations that they encountered, had to live with, and there's some of the reasons why you will see movement of your free
Yeah.
people of color in and out of different states is because of these restrictions. So thank you for allowing
Restrictions,
that.
violence, and everything. They
Yes.
weren't on a plantation, but their restrictions outside could be almost, documented the same way people on the plantation were experiencing. So I hope people understand the importance of what you're saying. They didn't have it that much better.
Right.
They really did not. And again,
it wasn't
knowing
like
what's
in
there.
Louisiana that,
Correct.
it was
Correct.
a different thing in other
Different.
states.
Absolutely.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there's any questions. Brian, I did not see any. I saw comments, talking about the information, but I didn't see any. And so I'm going to ask you if you saw any earlier, because if not, we will close this out. And comments and no questions. So Renata and everybody, thank you for joining us today for the podcast with the International African American Museum, the Center for Family History podcast. Thank you, Renata. I got a heartfelt thank you to you for being on. The knowledge that you shared has been excellent, and the perspectives, and of course, your dedication to preserving the history of your own family as well as others. Your work is not only inspiring, but it's crucial in ensuring that these stories, I'm going to say, be remembered and they get celebrated, because that is our goal. We are always trying to tell that story. And to all the viewers and listeners, whether you're joining us on StreamYard or on YouTube or in person, we appreciate your time and also your engagement. Your participation is what makes this podcast such a meaningful experience. So as we wrap up, quick reminder, next Saturday during the month of February on the 15th, we will have Dr. Jawan Johnson from the College of William and Mary. So mark your calendars and join us for that and another engaging conversation. Stay tuned to our social media channels and the website for any updates on topics and guest lineup. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep connecting with your history. From all of us at the International African American Museum, Center for Family History, take care, and you get your Saturday back. And thank you.